Hello and welcome to Lecture 2 for Justice, Ends and Means. And the topic of this discussion, this particular week, is the justice system. And this is one of these terms that we use quite often, quite casually in fact, and we don't often really think about it. In fact, we're probably more likely to talk about the criminal justice system than the justice system, or just the system. But in any case, we don't necessarily think what we mean when we talk about a system. And at the risk of sort of spending way too much time thinking about individual words, what we're interested in this week is the justice system, as a coherent set of procedures, coherent set of organisations that don't always match up or work very smoothly together, but that exist within an overall milieu, an overall social setting, where these different mechanisms, these different organisations are expected to work together. So in terms of criminal justice, there's a whole sort of continuum from crime prevention through to policing, through to courts, through to corrections, through to community corrections and deinstitutionalisation that are expected to work together in some kind of coherent way. And we often see some stresses in between those systems where the systems don't quite meet. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today, and we're going to think about what that means for someone who works in the system, because quite often people quite rightly complain about the system. They complain about the inconsistencies or the irrational parts of the system, but also underestimate the complexity of the systems and what's required for systemic change. And this is a theme we return to right at the end of the term when we come back in Module 10, where we talk about the systems thinking as a 21st century approach and as a way of thinking around change making, because we've gone beyond the level of social complexity where we can just pass some new laws to make things different. We've got all these cascading changes that occur throughout various systems in society when we change one thing, and that makes change particularly challenging. And challenging in a good and a bad way. It makes it more difficult, but it also makes it this very interesting puzzle to try and solve. Now, before we get too much further, I do want to mention that the first quiz is due this week. It is a formative assessment piece, which means it doesn't contribute to overall score, but it gives you some initial feedback, and it gives me some initial feedback on how everyone's going. And what's, I think, most important is it gives you all the experience of using the quiz system so that you're more confident when you come to do a graded assessment. So that's that. So getting back into the idea of the justice system and what it is, there's a whole lot of different terms and phrases referred to on page 3. And this is always difficult to pitch to a group of students such as yourselves, because I don't want to assume everyone knows all this stuff, but on the other hand, there is going to be some people who all do know this stuff and who are going to be bored by me going through, in depth, the definitions of all these terms. So the notes have a very quick overview of these terms, and I do think that it's something that if you are struggling to understand, there's no shame in that. If your education didn't involve anything, I know when I came into law school, the only way to get in to a higher ranking degree in Queensland back in the day was to do pretty much pure maths and science. Pure maths and science doesn't help you with law, and it certainly doesn't help you understand the institutions of state. So I myself had the experience of being quite confused by some of this stuff as soon as I hit law school. So yeah, these are things we can follow up on. I hope that the little brief definitions in the notes will help you orient yourself, but definitely if you do want to talk about this more, this is something that is really useful and important as the foundational knowledge is moving into the other material we'll discuss. And one of the big ones I open up with is neoliberalism, and that is something that is a lot of, I guess, confusion around what the word actually means. because it has the word liberalism in it, and that refers to several other things that don't have a whole lot in common with neoliberalism, like liberalism itself, or liberal values, or the Liberal Party, and so on. When we talk about neoliberalism, it's a belief system that has pretty much taken over most political agencies and parties. So it's one of these things that both, supposedly left, supposedly right, very much subscribe to. And it's very much a political ideology that's based on economic rationalism. It's based on user pays, and it's very much one that believes in small state and privatisation of state assets and state responsibilities. And it does mean that there's been a very big shift from our conventional way of seeing law and justice, which is very much vested in equality in the state, to this move towards neoliberalism, which is really much more about corporate power and saying that these things are not important to society. The economy is the only thing that's important, and we should really defer to corporate rule, corporate decision making, or the free market on a lot of things. So why I brought this up first is this attitude inflects a lot of the public debates around things. And some of the debates we try to have around justice and what is needed to achieve justice is more difficult than it's ever been in the past because of this set of beliefs. So there's lots of things that people have proposed that would improve things in terms of policing, would improve things in terms of corrections. There's been stacks of pilot projects where these things have been tried out and they've been successful, and yet they still struggle to be funded. And the problem with this is this attitude that governments have, which is, well, that's someone else's problem to fund, and that government shouldn't be about those issues, which is, for someone who has a very traditional background in liberalism as a belief system, as part of the legal system, it is very worrying and confronting when they're saying, well, we'll just sell off prisons to private enterprises and they can make money out of prisons. That's pretty frightening, because that's a really core business of society that the state should be overseeing quite closely, and shouldn't be just saying, well, we'll just find some corporations who will fund it, and who may give us, a nice cushy job once we leave Parliament or whatever. Which I know is a very cynical thing to say, but increasingly one of the problems with neoliberalism is this what's called the revolving door between government and corporations. And it becomes very easy to propose these kind of ideas where money is all that's important. And again, this is something that really only came into play in the 80s, but it is something that is deeply infused in Australia, both the Liberal Party, the Coalition, the Nationals, and Labor. Both sides are very, very much subscribing to this belief system. And when people say, I don't like politics because they're all the same, this is one reason. This is because this is this dominant belief in both sides of politics. Anyway, I wanted to introduce that because some people get really confused if they don't have that definition in mind, because they confuse that with like liberalism which is a set of beliefs around liberty and freedom, or they confuse it with the Liberal Party or whatever, but it's something quite different and distinct. All right, so there's lots of other things. There's representative democracy, separation of powers, federation, state, equality, rights. As I said, I don't want to bore everyone with just reading through these again. However, if you've got questions, the workshop will be a good time to ask them, to fill in those gaps. And to have discussions about this stuff. And if you think my definitions are in some way biased or too cynical or whatever, by all means we can have a discussion about that too. I believe I've been fairly objective in my description, but there's a thing with objectivity and subjectivity is you usually never see your own blind spots with this stuff. So it's going to be worth discussing. In terms of the justice system, we are talking about a connected set of subsystems that includes things like the law. And when we talk about the law, we generally think about the courts and the legal profession. Although, as we go further in these modules, we'll know that law crosses over lots of boundaries, but Let's just stick with that, capital L, the law at the moment. We're talking about the legal profession, the courts. It also includes Parliament, who make laws. It includes government, which is distinct from Parliament, who are the people who administer the justice system. And one of the tricky things we have in Australia and in the UK is the Westminster system. So let's just do a quick recap on the separation of powers. There's three forms of power in government. There's the legislative power, the power to make laws, the judicial power, the power to interpret laws and to enforce the laws, and administrative or executive power, which are the people who do the bureaucratic task of maintaining the laws, running the system. What's confusing, and in some countries like the United States, those things are all completely separate. So the president is not a member of Congress, for instance, or the Senate. They are completely separate. They're separate elections and so on. What's confusing about our system, about the Westminster system, is that the Prime Minister and the ministers, or the Premier and ministers, they're members of the legislature, but they're also heads of the executive. So there's this kind of hybrid thing where at the top level, you've got the Prime Minister, who is not just the head of the party that has the most power in the representative system. And interestingly enough, the Australian Constitution doesn't mention political parties. I think that's a very interesting thing that I don't want to get sidetracked about right now. But the Prime Minister is the head of that political group of the elected representatives, but is also the head of the civil service. It's the head of all the administration in Australia. And, the Minister for Education is also the head of all the administrative bodies that are part of the executive educational system. So that leads to some outcomes that we'll, talk about later in the term. But for the moment, it's important to know that there is these three forms of power. They're generally kept separate. Generally, the head of the executive part of government was the monarch, and in our system is the governor or the governor general as the representative of the monarch, and that's a largely ceremonial role. So, again, there is some reserve powers that the governor or governor general has, but most of the executive power then sits in with the Prime Minister or Premier. And one of the themes, again, flagging this, that we're going to come across later in the term, is the spread of executive power and the rise of things like executive orders as a new way to govern, and the fact that there's not the checks and balances or controls over those things that there is over the exercise of power by the legislature. And that's why increasingly leaders are trying to sort of sneak things through sideways using executive orders. But that's the theme for a whole area. In terms of the separation of powers, one thing we do have as a strict separation is judicial from other forms of power. And this happened, this caused some problems in the early days of industrial relations, where the government tried to set up an industrial court that would not only be an admin body that would oversee industrial relations and labour law, but also a court that would exercise judgment, and that was held to be unconstitutional because you couldn't have the judicial and the executive powers overlapping like that. So judicial is always kept separate from those other forms of power. All right, so in terms of the justice system, we've got the law, we've got Parliament, we've got government, which is the executive and administration and the all that part of the justice system. We've got police and we've got corrections as the main dominant parts of the justice system. We also have a lot of overlap between other parts of the system. So we've got things like welfare. We've got regulators across multiple fields who regulate things that can tie back into the justice system. So the tax office largely has a regulatory interest and is largely a big administration. But when people break the rules, they can be sent into the legal system. There are political systems that integrate somehow within that big notion of the justice system, and there's the media, which technically should be sitting outside as a gate, I was going to say overseer, that's the wrong word, but has a role in oversight of government systems, and being the watchman of the government systems. But of course the media has its own issues in terms of where its power lies and where its objectivity may be compromised by money. All right, so systems are, in the industrial world, the rational, coherent, scientific way to manage the world, for good or ill. And there is some good, because we wouldn't have been able to organise things as efficiently without this. And the sociologist Max Weber was actually very keen on bureaucracies, and he was writing a long while ago, but he saw it as a break from the networks of family power and influence that you got under a feudal system, and even in like post-feudal societies where you had a rich noble class who could just exercise influence. Weber saw the power of a bureaucracy in being something that was independent of that power and could exercise power fairly. And I think it's very interesting to maintain Weber's perspective, because we know that bureaucracies descend into nightmares very, very quickly, but also to get that sense that they came out of a time where if someone was Lord someone or other, or Lord someone or other's son, they just got away with anything they wanted to, because of the privilege of that position. And while money and power can still buy you a whole lot more justice than it does for other people, at least it's not that blatant situation where it's like, oh, well, he did it, but, he's a lord, so there's nothing we can do about it. In terms of what the problems are with systems, I talk about a few of those things in the notes, but we are becoming very conscious of systemic discrimination, systemic biases, that systems can be set up a way, and even systems that look fair on the basis of it may not actually be fair in the way in which they operate. And one example of that from the United States civil rights history was the post-Reconstruction laws in the South after the Civil War. A lot were created to criminalise behaviours that formerly enslaved people were required to do. So, for instance, one excellent example of this was the slavery era laws. Of course, a slave would not be able to move from town to town without permission of their owner. But the Reconstruction law just basically substituted employer for owner. Nice, neat substitution there. And it then became criminal for a person of colour to move from town to town without permission of their employer. And a lot of people, as the old industrial structures, the whole structures of slavery in the South dissolved, had to travel to work. There was a massive period of social change in the South. And then suddenly it became illegal for someone who was unemployed to travel without permission of their employer, because they had no employer. They needed to move to enable to get an employer. And on the face of it, if you looked at the laws, there was an argument that these were completely fair and objective, because they said, well, no one's allowed to move around without permission of their employer, ignoring the fact that there were, unemployed wealthy people who were fine. They were never going to get arrested for it. But there is that difference, that's that sort of example of systemic discrimination. It doesn't necessarily have to refer to discriminatory language or discriminatory categories in the language of the law if it is able to substantively do the same thing in the way that it is applied. So that's when we talk about systemic discrimination. We also talk about systemic violence, and that's a theme that's taken up much more fully in the subject, understanding violence and conflict. And that's, again, understanding more about the way in which systems can actually create harm in the way in which they operate. And an example that's often given by that is if poverty and starvation kills 100 times more people than murder, why are we focusing so much on murder as an issue of justice when there's 100 times more people who are dying from starvation? And that's that understanding that if you take a look at the end results, there are bigger issues and there are bigger harms that are being done to people than are being done by individual offenders. It's not really an argument to say we shouldn't stop murderers or anything like that, but I think it's a sobering idea that some of these big systems and big structures in society are worse, and they certainly deserve at least equal attention to the attention we pay. So some of the problems with these kind of systems, including the justice system, first of all, is hierarchical power. This was something that is, I think, pretty much a hangover from the old days of feudalism and the old days of, the king and the barons and the dukes and lords and whatever, and this perception of society as a pyramid where the most important and worthy people are at the top, and then, all the way down to the peasants and the serfs. And with the era of revolutions and democracy, we supposedly flattened that idea or inverted it, where the people are most important at the top and they delegate power down through their representatives to the smaller number of people who serve the populace. It's popular sovereignty. But of course, people still tend to see things in terms of hierarchies. They still tend to see them in terms of these, the boss at the top and everyone underneath. Now, that idea in terms of business management, you might be surprised, I know I was surprised to find out, has really been disavowed in business since the 1950s, 1960s, when they realised it was a really bad way to manage organisations, that flattened organisational structures with obligations up and down were a much better way to run organisations. And yet I'm sure all of you will know of an organisation, you may work for one, that still uses this, pardon me, this pyramid style structure where the boss sees themselves as being the most important at the top and everyone else underneath them being of decreasing worth as you go down. So one of the problems with systems, I don't think this is necessarily a problem with the systems approach entirely, because there's lots of businesses that have been very successful at challenging this and using more consultative structures, and they work really well. Japan has always had very interesting different structures within businesses that have some hierarchies and some inverted hierarchies and so on. But I guess I'm just mentioning here that as soon as you tell someone that they're more important than everyone else, you'll tend to have the narcissists and psychopaths going for that job, and they'll start surrounding themselves with other narcissists and psychopaths. And you really need to, if you have any control at all over the system, try and protect it from that kind of thing and try and produce a system that is more open and accountable. Counter to that is the idea of diffuse power, and that is the idea that power is not something that exists naturally as a concentrated top of the pyramid. That's a really artificial way of seeing things, that power exists in a really diffuse way, and it's a grassroots thing. And it collects in areas, but it collects in areas as it's gathered from that low-level power. Now, including in terms of organisations, this makes a whole lot of sense. The hierarchical idea of power and control, where everyone is obeying the boss at the top because they're scared that the boss will, do something if they don't work, clearly doesn't work. In fact, it usually produces resistance in the form of people just going, well, if they're going to be like that about it, I'm going to do the minimum amount of work that I'm actually required to do, if that. However, if people are accountable from the bottom up for an organisation and they believe in it, they'll tend to do a lot more work, and they'll tend to be a lot more committed than doing it because they think of that pyramid power structure. So I want to have you think about that idea of diffuse power systems, and to think about that for what that means for elements of the justice system. And we're going to talk about different elements as we go on, but what does it mean for the courts? I mean, the courts are highly hierarchical in terms of the judge being very important. But if you think of the judge as just a different civil servant with a different sort of job and a set of responsibilities, then the system becomes a lot more collaborative and a lot more interesting. And the same with policing. I mean, one of the big problems with trying to improve the police service has always been this top-down approach. And the policing model was based on military models, which was very much the exemplar of this command and control model. So we've seen some resignation of police commissioners and tops of the police service for very different reasons, but largely because this model where they're supposed to control and be accountable for something that individual officers do in the field doesn't work, has never worked. You can never enact change in an organisation by trying to push it through exercise of power. And yet we still keep expecting these heads of organisations to be able to do that. What else have I mentioned there? Privilege, the idea that there is power that's unspoken within systems, probably unacknowledged, and may not even be acknowledged by a person who has privilege. I am constantly aware, or I make myself aware of, being a white middle-class male academic. That gives me access to a lot of privileges that someone who's an Indigenous person who is living in poverty in Australia does not have access to. And it's not just about the formal aspects of power, things like income and access to formal justice, but it's also about the privilege of just being someone for whom life is just made easier for. And there's a lot, we know there's a whole lot of culture war stuff about privilege, and there's a whole lot of people saying, but I'm white and poor, I'm not more privileged than someone who's a person of colour who's poor, but they just willingly are either ignorant or willingly ignoring some of the other aspects of privilege and are only seeing things through the lens of economics, of income earning potential, and ignoring the fact that there is, very different ways people are policed and treated, and things like generational poverty and how they affect people. All right, some other concepts before we finish off. How we're going? Oh, 30 minutes, which means, if you're still listening, good on you. A lot of people don't make it this far in lectures. Representation, and that's a form of power where you delegate your power to someone else. And again, that's a very important systemic thing. Having everyone get together to vote on every single issue is impractical, although it's certainly more feasible now than it was in the dawn of democracy. We certainly have a possibility of popular democracy through the internet that was never existed in the past. Not that anyone's really managed to do that. But representation is an essential part of a lot of our systems, and that's the idea that someone else will exercise power on your behalf within certain systemic constraints and checks and balances. The most obvious one we think about is the members of Parliament or members of the Senate. We vote for them, and through the voting process we delegate responsibility for them to act on our behalf and in our interests. But it exists in other roles as well. A judge is someone we don't vote for, not in Australia, but we have a system of checks and balances, whether they work or not, or whether there's problems in them. Let's set that aside for the moment, where we delegate the power to make adjudications to someone who's a specialist, who's got experience and knowledge in that field, in the hope and trust that they are going to be able to administer justice in a way that we can't get everyone together to make a decision. We do, not only is that unfeasible, but there's very extremely technical issues. You wouldn't say the same thing about medicine. You wouldn't say, well, let's vote in the doctor that we think's the best doctor, who tells us the best news. You actually want a doctor who's skilled at what they're doing and knows something about medicine to be a doctor. So a lot of our forms of representation are tied up with existing structures of privilege, which is why I mentioned it, and sources of power such as economic power. But those are sort of flaws in the system. They're not necessarily a core part of it. That we need systems that are better and are more accountable, rather than just saying that everyone should be represented by a political ballot or whatever. Having police officers is a way of delegating the power around violence in society and being able to control people physically and to use legitimated violence. Again, we don't vote for police officers because ideally we want the best people who are the most trained, who have been validated through the system to be police officers, rather than the people who are the most popular. So we delegate power through representation in all sorts of different ways, not just voting. Couple more issues I want to bring up before we're completely out of time. The first is, and it was one we're going to come back to again, is post-colonialism, which you may have heard from time to time. We exist in a world where just a little over 100 years ago, there were global imperial powers. There were colonial powers that controlled most of the rest of the globe, largely European powers, although the United States was working its way up into being a big imperial colonizing power as well. And these nations, these organizational groups, gained an awful lot of economic power through the exploitation of the natural resources of the rest of the world. And that was backed up by military power and technological dominance. In the 20th century, we saw a lot of those power structures collapse. We saw all those different European empires collapse. America has maintained more of its economic ascendancy. The USSR maintained its colonies for quite a while until the collapse of their system. Although Russia is now trying to recolonize its former colonies as well. And when we're talking about post-colonialism, we're talking about the difficult path back to independence from all those colonized people. Because not only have they had all their natural resources already plundered by those economic powers, but they've also had their culture and political structures decimated in the colonial period. Colonizers were great at, redefining boundaries, redefining national boundaries under their own, rules and reasons, and putting diverse ethnic groups, often that didn't like each other, together. And often they would quite deliberately put groups that there was friction together. The British, for instance, were well known for doing this. And what they did in India, what was formerly India, now India and Pakistan, was basically fuel the flames of religious hatred in a way that got the colonized people fighting each other rather than the empire. So post-colonialism is about the legacy of that, and the fact that you can't just give people autonomy. The colonizers can't just march out one day and say, by the way, you are now responsible for everything, good luck. There is consequences, and we've seen that around the world. So we'll talk a little bit later about post-colonialism as well. The idea of decolonizing. Australia is an interesting example because we're a country that still has a lot of the largest part of the population in Australia are people who are the descendants of the colonizers, the people who came into the nation, and yet we're still going through this decolonizing process, this idea of, a lot of our state boundaries, a lot of our systems were set up around urban centres by the European powers. What does that mean for the rest of the country that exists outside of that? And traditionally, it's the rural areas get a lot of neglect, and the First Nations areas even more neglect and overt mistreatment under those colonial structures. And it's very hard to decolonize yourself, to change the way you think, to try and think about how do we act in a way that's fair for everyone, not just for the people who are in the urban centres. Final concept I want to talk about is advocacy. And advocacy is a process by which we talked about representation a little bit before, where people who have more access to justice, the machinery of justice, the forms of power, they have the cultural understanding of those systems, act on the behalf of others. And that exists in a lot of different ways in our system. In many ways, if you think about policing, In its purest form, policing is a form of advocacy. It's a form of using state power in terms of legitimated violence, legitimated force, to act as advocates for victims. We often don't frame policing in that way, or don't frame law in that way. We tend to frame law in terms of obeying the values of society, for instance. But there is a strong argument that what police are a kind of an advocate group who use the use of force to advocate on behalf of those who shouldn't be using force, who are the general members of society. But we see advocacy in all sorts of forms throughout the public sector, and for people who are aiming for a career in the justice system, in the justice sector, the justice professions, it's an important concept that we return to in terms of ethics. Who are we representing? Who are we advocating for? How do we understand their interests? How do we communicate with them about their interests? And what do we do in order to sit at the, often the friction-driven interface between the big structures and rules of and systems of society and individuals? So something to think about, something we'll come back to, and something we'll talk about in the workshops this week when we talk through the concept of rights and what rights mean in terms of the justice system. And I will see you then.